Welcome to The Lost Debate, a show for political eclectics. I'm Ravi Gupta, and today I talk to two authors, Robert Gordon and Nick Bagley. Robert Gordon is a fellow at the Kennedy School at Harvard and a former Biden-Obama official. Nick is a University of Michigan law professor. They wrote this article that I absolutely love. It's called Democrats Should Fire Bad Teachers and Bad Cops. There are certain topics and conversations that I just know the Lost Debate audience is going to love. You're going to love this one. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Robert and Nick, welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Well, you wrote this article for The Argument with, one of my favorite titles of the year, which is Democrats Should Fire Bad Teachers and Bad Cops. What's interesting to me is I actually think Democrats in theory have no problem with the idea of firing bad cops, but I don't think they fully understand the relationship between these two sort of classes of employment because they're both unionized public sector workforces and actually operate by some of the same rules. So let's start where you started in your piece, which is these sort of competing interests as you describe them that the left has as it relates to these public sector unions.
Yeah. Glad to start. A less exciting, but maybe more the whole argument title would be Democrats should make government work. And that's a principle that's got to apply across the board. And if you want to have effective public services and you want people to get their money's worth when they pay their taxes, you need to have a system where people are appropriately paid and well paid, but they're also accountable. And that applies on both ends. It means if you're doing a great job, we should make extra efforts to keep you and give you a pathway to go forward in your career. And if you're not doing a great job, we should give you a chance to improve. But if you don't, you really can't be in that job anymore. And that's how effective organizations work. And unfortunately, it is not generally how government works, particularly, unfortunately, in blue states and cities.
And Nick, you guys talk about how often there's this effect of public sector unions, which is to actually do everything possible to actually minimize the differences in how employees are treated, which it has a downstream effect of actually flattening out the performance of these employees.
Yeah, you have to remember that unions represent their members. They don't represent the public. And that does create some real gaps. What they're interested in is making sure that their members have job security, that they continue to get paid better over the course of their careers. And in principle, those are good, valuable goals. But when you push them too far, you create real distortions. One of the really big distortions is that by declining to pay people based on their performance and by insisting on lockstep wages that increase over time, well, that rewards union members, but makes it really hard to recruit good young people into the profession. Like if what you want to do is get really great teachers and cops, what you do is pay them really high wages out of the gate. And then you'd reward the better teachers and the better cops over the course of their careers. And you'd pay the ones that were more effective more. And instead, what we tend to see in blue cities and states is that entry-level salaries are really low. Promises are made to pay big pensions down the line. Pay increases kind of automatically depending on your years of service and useless master's degrees or whatever else. And what you get are a bunch of, folk who are not as motivated, who are not being pushed to be accountable to the public. And as a result, we get low quality public services.
Yeah, and actually, if you get motivated people, which I'm sure there are plenty who enter the profession, there's very little incentive. Like the only thing that maintains that motivation is intrinsic at this point. There's nothing extrinsic within the system to reward go-getters, whether it's exceptional results or exceptional dedication and time.
I was a school teacher in New York City. I've worked with some of those heroes, people who have that kind of intrinsic motivation, and they are saints. But the one thing I know is that you can't run a system based on saints. Like that's just doesn't reflect human nature. You got to have a system that pushes people who might otherwise shirk to do a better job.
Yeah. And Robert, you guys quote from the statistic from Matthew Iglesias that New York City pays 70% higher teacher salaries than Louisiana, but entry-level pay is only about 7% higher. And I think for a lot of people listening to this, they'll be like, why is that the case? Like, why is it in the union's interest to backload so much of the compensation and the money spent within the system?
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to ask them to say for sure. But I think the answer is that you have a membership, and particularly you have leadership that is generally older, and you have people who are in a field where the deal is you stick around and you get a strong pension, and that works for some people. But as you said, particularly today, particularly for young people who are go getters and for young people who might be thinking about different careers, starting pay really matters. And if you think about life in big cities today where affordability is such an enormous concern, starting pay really, really matters. And it is a huge challenge. We have a huge teacher shortage in a lot of places in this country. We have trouble recruiting and have all of the compensation buried in the back of a person's career. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Particularly, I'll add one more thing, is just it's kind of human nature that even if you hold out that there's going to be a great pension 25, 30 years ago, that is not what you were thinking a lot about. Some economists could say, well, the net present value of the pension is enormous. But that's not how people think. They think, can I pay rent? Can I go out for dinner once in a while? And if that, which is perfectly normal, is how you're thinking, that pension in 25 years is not a recruiting tool. The recruiting tool is what's my starting salary?
Well, and Nick, you as somebody who worked in the New York City school system, probably have an innate sense of this. I used to be a charter school principal, so I took advantage of the dynamics you're talking about. So we used to pay more for entry level teachers, even though we got about 80% of the per pupil funding of traditional schools. Given how poorly compensated teachers were in their first few years, we were still able to be more competitive in those first few years because the real money is spent later on, right? So we would get these go getters and all that. And the theory that I settled on back then was that the unions tend to be, whether it's cops or teachers or anything else, they're dominated by the experienced members. Like the experienced members show up, they vote in elections, they know each other, uh, and they know what to vote for. They're a little bit more savvy, like they know how to vote their interests a little bit more than the younger teachers. And I'm curious, Nick, if you picked this up and if there's like any sort of objective basis for that instinct.
Yeah, it's definitely right. And it's not only it's not only that union elections are dominated by sort of more established members with longer tenure. It's also that the unions play all sorts of games to maximize their political influence. So one of the favorite tricks of the unions is to decentralize power so that you get it out of the hands of mayors or anybody who's accountable to a local citywide electorate. And that way you can do lots of things to curry favor with your membership that no member of the public can push back against. Another favorite is to have off-year elections for school boards. So school board here in Ann Arbor, for example, is elected not when there's a presidential election, not when there's a big election to Congress, but instead in these off-year elections where almost nobody participates. And the only meaningful public input comes from the Michigan Democratic Party convention, where you have to be an insider in order to show up and make sure that your self-selected people can take control. And that ends up just meaning that the officials who make school policy are themselves selected because of their affinity with union goals. Now, there's nothing intrinsically wrong about what the unions are doing from their internal perspective. They're supposed to represent their membership. They're supposed to represent the people who elect them. And if that happens to be long established members, well, so be it. The problem is that we let them get away with it. And we let them do it even at the public's expense when the public interest is in, effectively run schools, effectively managed schools, schools that stay open, say, during the COVID pandemic instead of closing, as my schools did for about a year and a half. So that's the real problem, I think, is the way that unions exploit their political power to cement themselves. And I haven't even mentioned the biggest way they do that, which is they take membership dues and they spend lavishly on political campaigns.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody, I've spent a lot of time in Democratic politics. It used to be, I worked for Obama's first campaign. There used to be more room to sort of deviate from the unions, or Obama did it to some extent. By today's standards, it was incredibly courageous. Back then, there was a little bit more of a movement to challenge those forces. Now it's almost unquestioned in most corners of the Democratic Party. And we've talked now about the incentivizing good people in the work and kind of like trying to create an environment for ambitious people to pursue this work. My general theory is like by almost any other sort of estimation, if you look at any other field or even sports, we recognize that there are outliers that are excellent.
Yeah.
LeBron James, right, et cetera. But there's this myth out there that people in unions and the sort of their political affiliates want to say, which is you can't really measure great teaching. And we don't know what great teaching is. Nick, you were a teacher. What do you say to that?
That's horse shit. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be profane, but
No,
like,
go for it.
I mean, anybody with kids in a school knows that there are good teachers and bad teachers. Any principal who's ever managed a school knows that there are good teachers and bad teachers. And yeah, some of that's intangible, but guess what? That's true for white collar work as a general matter. It's often hard to measure how effective people are. But the answer to that is not to give up trying, it's to actually work at it. It boggles my mind. We actually have tons of good research about especially teachers, but we also have good research on cops. We know how bad the worst teachers are for kids. We know how violent the worst cops are on the streets. We know how to identify the low performers, and we just don't. I find it galling.
And you have some data in here that's very interesting, which is Raj Chetty's research. If you replace the worst 5% of teachers with the average teacher, you increase the lifetime earnings, I think, of a student by $250,000, more than $250,000. You also have data about the costs of the 1%, the worst 1% of officers, Robert. I'm curious if you could explain this to us.
Yeah. One interesting thing, we all have in our minds an idea of like distributions tend to be like normal, the bell curve, and there's like a certain number of people at the top end and the bottom end, and they have a certain relationship. People who are bad at their jobs, really bad at their jobs, are often really, really bad at their jobs, sort of off of the traditional bell curve. That's a finding across professions. And I think to Nick's point, you can experience it as a parent, knowing teachers. People, with police force are obviously most officers doing their best, doing a solid job, and there's some people who do terrible things. In both cases, actually, it's not only do they personally have a particularly bad impact, those bad impacts have larger harms. Like if you want public trust in schools, you can't have teachers showing up having kids watch movies every day. And if you want public trust in our police force, you have to deal with the officers who use excessive force and make bad arrests. So this is not just like Nick and Robert have it in for low performers. We want the public sector to deliver, and we want it to deliver in a way that people feel confident about. And the fact that we make this so incredibly difficult, and everyone knows, and if you've ever worked in government, you know that the process for moving people out who are low performers in the public sector is just insanely difficult. There's step upon step upon step. There's justification requirements, and so people don't do it.
Yep.
And so yeah, so I think the harms here, like we like to look away and say this isn't a big deal, but it actually is really important for how well institutions perform and how much people believe in them.
And
You know,
just imagine
totally.
how demoralizing that is, too, for cops and teachers, right? If you have a terrible sergeant or if your assistant principal has been promoted beyond his or her abilities, like your job sucks. And your job sucks because you show up and bust your ass every day, and there are a bunch of people who are just punching a paycheck and making your job harder and worse.
Yeah, the equivalent is this would be like in the early 2000s when LeBron James first gets into the NBA and the team has to make cuts. If they did it like a school or a police force did, they would cut LeBron first because he's the youngest, and they would take the 15-year veteran who might be riding the bench and be like, "Actually, you're going to start." That's how we run our schools and our police forces. And as Stephen Brill wrote in Class Warfare years ago, I think his analogy was he says it takes longer and more process to fire a bad teacher than it was to convict O.J. Simpson in trial. And you have some data from 2011, 2012, which I can't imagine has changed that much, which is only 1 in 1,000 teachers with tenure. I think this must have been in New York, were fired or non-renewed. 1 in 1,000. And so, as you're saying, like people looking around are saying, told that it's anti-teacher to talk like anti-cop or whatever. But if you talk to the people who are exceptional and dedicated at their jobs, like Nick, as you mentioned, this has got to be annoying to you to look around and see these people. And in some cases, you have to answer to them because promotion, like whether it's the captains, the sergeants, or the principals, are following the same illogic and lack of meritocracy as the same hire as the decision to hire people in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ways that I've sort of tried to wrap my head around the good that unions can do, like in principle at least, a public sector union can be out there fighting for workers and fighting to make sure that you get really highly compensated, talented workforce. After all, it's a concentrated block of workers who can then serve as a counterweight to governments when they want to try to, lower taxes, for the elderly or whatever else. They could say, no, 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 hold on. Like we, the teachers, we, the cops are doing an important work. Like you got to pay us commensurate with our importance to the community. The trouble is when you get to these kinds of work rules, the last in, first out rules, the rules that make it really difficult to transfer, the extraordinary disciplinary hurdles that you have to overcome. That's where you really see the degradation of public service. And I think it's hard to attract good people into the profession when you know it's going to be a bunch of not that motivated people around you, or at least a small percentage that make it kind of crappy for everyone else and make it hard to do your job effectively.
Yeah, and I think you might have seen this, but I think Malcolm Gladwell did a episode of revisionist history, I think in this past year or two, where he actually talked about how he kind of laid the sort of the background for George Floyd. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, back to protections that the teachers union had gotten for all municipal workers. So essentially saying like the reason why some of these terrible officers with histories of misconduct are allowed to stay on the force is because the same logic that's applying to cops is applying to teachers. And although like Democrats, like it's not politically popular to protect cops the way they protect teachers, generally speaking, you have to kind of apply the same logic. It's really hard, and nor is it probably moral to like say this one group of municipal employees get a totally different logic. And my favorite example is I think it was also Minneapolis is the Jeffrey Dahmer case. In Jeffrey Dahmer, famously for people who follow that case, this was portrayed in the Netflix show. He had a victim in his house who escaped and gets out onto the street and goes to a police officer naked, bleeding, being like, "Hey, this guy's trying to kill me, maybe trying to eat me too." I don't know what he said, and pleading with the officer, saying, "Please save me." And this officer was so incompetent and maybe homophobic that he then brought this guy back to Jeffrey Dahmer to murder, right? And so years go by where this officer is, guys are going through hearings, they're trying to fire him and all that. Robert, Nick, what do you think happened to this officer? Just guess. You might not be familiar with this. He
I'm
became the head of the
definitely
union. He not only was he not fired, he became the head of the police union. This is how these decisions are made. And that's not, to me, that's not accidental, because what you want, what they're selecting for are the people who are not just going to defend people who are unfairly treated, but they want people who are going to zealously defend anybody against any accountability whatsoever. So to me, it wasn't accidental that this guy became the head of the union.
Yeah,
I
sometimes the people who kind of rise in the union are the ones who've turned to the union to protect them in their hour of darkest need. It's not great when it comes to the public interest.
Yeah, so one of the sort of issues that's in the background of all of this is just the sheer cost of all of these decisions. Obviously, there are costs in lives, whether it's people who have to deal with the police force or who have to go through these schools, but also the cost of these pensions. Like all of these decisions, we have a lot of short termism here in New York. Under Mamdani, we have a $10+ billion budget deficit heading into next year, in many ways driven by humongous costs of our school system, $43,000 per student, probably the most anywhere in the country. And you say that public sector pensions have more than $1 trillion shortfall right now. What's going on here? Like, what's driving this?
Yeah, there's a few things going on. Like, first, want to start saying, like, people should retire with security. That should be a goal we have in society. It should be a goal we have for public sector workers. I think the question is, given that there's not infinite money, where should we spend money on compensating people? So what has happened with public sector pensions is a few things. One, the public sector is able to make commitments that it doesn't fully fund. That's actually very hard for companies to do because of the way that we have changed pension laws. It's very easy for the public sector to do. And because of that, there's a there's just a natural dynamic where a politician can make commitments now to increase pensions, and those payments have to be made at some future date. And the politician gets to celebrate, and everyone gets to be happy, and the bill gets delivered to the next guy or the next woman who's the governor or the next legislature. And on top of that, you can jimmy the funding, and you can underfund these requirements. And so when they already exist, you can say, we're going to assume a 8% annual return, and that's what we're going to get on this, and therefore we don't need to put as much money in. And the combination of these factors has led to this problem of pensions occupying more and more of state and city budgets. And it just creates a very real trade-off. And again, wish it weren't like this. And, personally, all for raising taxes on wealthy people. Like, I think that's important. We should do it nationally. I don't have a problem with states and cities doing it more. You can do a lot of that. It's not going to make these problems go away. And the result is you have this unfortunate trade-off where you're putting more money into a pension that's not going into hiring teachers or cops or providing after school services or providing childcare or all the other things that our leaders rightly are talking about to address people's everyday problems. So those are the trade-offs. It's not a good political dynamic.
Yeah, New York City, you have, in the case of Mamdani, somebody who is talking about expanding in some ways things like childcare and talks about adding more teachers, increasing compensation, et cetera, and at the same time is deferring pension fund payments. So does not want to even pay for the commitments that we've made. And I agree, Robert, like people should retire in security. My mom is on the city pension. Like she's a city nurse. The problem I have is that actually, like, at some point, this is not the federal government. You can't print money, right? So at some point, they're going to have to do something drastic. And in New York City, we already are among the highest taxed in the country, relying on an outsized percentage of our funding. I think something like 70+% of our funding comes from the top 10% of earners. So taxing the quote unquote wealthy is going to get harder and harder and harder. I think the 1% is about 50%.
Yeah,
So, you
I'll
know,
tell you, like, again, just personally, like, I, I get pretty juiced about taxing the wealthy in New York City. I think it's a city that I'm actually not going to leave. I think it's a good thing to do more of personally. There's just a limit on how much money you can raise. So, like, as an example, the pied-à-terre tax that is in the latest budget that Mamdani pushed for, and again, personally, all for it, raises, I think, on the order of $500 million a year. They think it may bring in much less because there'll be a fair amount of evasion. At the same time, the budget deal that Albany entered into, which restored older reductions in pensions for teachers who came into the system later and made it easier to retire early, including, I believe, at age 58, that pension reduction is going to cost about the same amount, about $500 million a year. So it's great. We're talking about how we're going to take all the savings from taxing the rich and use them on childcare. But actually, if you consider New York's budget globally, this is going to be supporting pensions. And I just think if you asked people, is that what I want? Is that what the people who are in the streets supporting Mamdani actually where they want that money to go? I don't even think that's where they want it.
yeah, I think like where I am on this is if you want to argue for higher taxes just to penalize the rich, then make that argument purely, right? And some people do make that argument purely. But if, as most people say, they want to tax the rich in order to expand high quality services, then the high quality part of that needs to be pure. And in New York City, you look around and you're like, why does it cost so much to build a more subway track? As the New York Times, some people like Brian Rosenthal, Emma Fitzsimmons have written about, or why we just recently did an episode on this. Why does it cost $43,000 per student in the New York City school system? And the answer is almost never, because that increased funding leads to better services. It's usually because of some interest group that gets paid in a way that actually, in some cases disincentivizes higher quality services in some of the ways that we've defined. So that's the problem I have is like, look, if you just want to punish people, just make that argument, and then you have to deal with the consequences of the politics of that, right? And I generally agree people aren't going to leave New York, but you start to go down that list a little bit more, instead of the 1%, you get to the 10%. Now you're starting to talk about people who, you know, like either could leave or they're like they're tighter, like, than a person who's 1%. That might just be a lawyer at a law firm, right? Or a surgeon that who's paying 60% of their taxes and money in taxes, and things start to get a little gnarly at that point.
I think class warfare is really sexy. It's fun. You can make great signs about it. Managing a complicated system, whether that's a transit system or a school system or a police department, it's really hard. And it's hard to make that salient to voters. One thing you can look at, and you can just see this visually, is if you chart the per pupil spending in the states against the performance of the students, you see there's almost no relationship between the amount per pupil that you spend and the kinds of results that we're getting, which suggests to me that what we've got is, not so much a problem of inadequate resources in the system as it is a management problem. Now, it can be a management problem that you can partly address through enhanced resources, but primarily what you're looking at is a management problem. And that's where I think that the union involvement for Robert and for me is so concerning, is they make it very difficult to achieve the kinds of reforms that we all want. I mean, another way of putting it is that in urban school districts across the country, about 2/3 of kids in fourth grade can't read proficiently. 2/3. That's not like everybody's doing okay and we're sort of making it by and there are a couple of like rough outliers out there. That is a failure of the vast majority of students in our urban schools, who are, by the way, usually the Black and brown students that Democrats claim to care about. So if you really care about disadvantaged kids, you've got to keep your eye on the ball, which is, how do we make sure those schools are giving them the tools they need to succeed in the future? And, Democrats have really taken their eyes off the ball over the course of the last 20 or so years. Robert is a veteran of those education reform wars. I was a Teach for America guy back in the day, and that kind of reformist energy has just leaked out of the party.
I want to make 2 points, one following up in line with where Nick was going, and one just a little bit of a caution for all of us who mostly agree. The agreement is, if you look at the states that have made the biggest gains on reading, and I think you did an episode on Mississippi.
Mhm.
Mississippi, before that it was
And I started a school in Mississippi. Yeah, I was down there. Yeah. I have no personal, like, our charters did not drive those results. Our charters
Yeah.
actually in Mississippi are mediocre,
Yeah.
to be clear.
Well, but I mean, great
Yeah.
down there. So Louisiana before that. There's a great paper about how Louisiana accomplished these huge gains, and they decided they were going to be super clear on the goal of getting reading and math learning up. They knew what they needed to do. They needed to have kids reading challenging texts in class and talking about them. And math, they needed them doing hard problems. And they're going to orient everything around that. And they reorganized aggressively the way they did curriculum instruction and the way that the central education department was structured. In the process, they let go about half the people who were in that central department. It's not a huge number, but we've been talking about teachers and police. Often very high leverage jobs are leading these departments, or engineering jobs, which Nick and I can go on about, or technologist jobs. And they often end up in the same super constrained buckets. And it hugely reduces what's possible. I don't think in Louisiana, they reorganized. They changed how they work. They were able to do far more with far fewer people. And it was because they had this flexibility. I will tell one happy story here related. Colorado's Department of Technology recently totally reorganized. They are the leading tech department in the country. You can read Jen Paulka's written a lot about this. Modernized, great stuff. What did they do? They started off by saying, we need people who can do human-centered design, who can be hands-on keyboard doing coding. And that's not who our department's full of. It's full of people who are doing other kinds of work. They're people who are experts in procurement. We want to stop recruiting. We want to do the work in-house. They let go 173 people, and they're cruising. They're leading the way. So I think flexibilities in these central offices are hugely, hugely important.
Let me just add to some of the things you just said before you give your sort of caveat. We talked to Zach Liskow, who I know from college, and we'll link in the show notes.
He's a good friend.
To that interview. Great guy. And you point to some of his research about just the importance of super high quality, I think it was engineers in the rail system, I think in public sector infrastructure in California.
Mostly highways in Connecticut, actually, is what that
in Connecticut
study is about. Yeah.
And I think this was to illustrate the sort of fact that sometimes expertise and excellence doesn't follow a bell curve. And you cite a different study about this. It's a power law where a small amount of truly exceptional people drive most of the results. And I think the power law can go both ways, as we described. Also, like to the cop example, the power law could be on the downside, where actually a small number of completely catastrophically poor performers are causing a lot of damage. And I think like that is in a lot of sectors they work that way, right? I certainly saw this in teaching, right, where like a truly excellent teacher can completely change a life in the way that five sort of mediocre teachers couldn't. And also like a really, really bad teacher can destroy a life, right? You can unjustly punish a kid. The kid cannot learn to read at the right time, blah, 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 blah. Robert, you were going to give a caveat to this though.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as Nick mentioned, I was a part of the ed reform wars of I guess it's just about an earlier generation, the Obama
Yeah,
time.
me too.
And we tried to do a lot of things Nick and I are talking about, and it didn't take. And I think we need to honestly confront why that was. Some of it's about, well, unions, opponents organized, they out organized, and we can be, can be mad about that. But I think also two things. I think one, we did get carried away with the test scores and with making people feel like everything turned on these test scores. We lost not just teachers, but parents because of that, who wanted education to be more diverse. I think test scores remain incredibly important, but we need to contextualize them, particularly in a world that's changing as fast as ours. So that's error one. I think error two is it was not just a coalition of the willing. I think the willing actually got a lot done. Like the willing, DC went hard. DC still has a meaningful performance-based system for teachers, unlike most places. And by the way,
It's
DC
killing
is
it.
killing
Yeah.
it. It's a blue
Yeah.
jurisdiction. It's the only blue jurisdiction, I think,
And
that
by the
is
way,
still.
killing it for now. We just had a mayoral election there. I just spoke to some people yesterday in that system. I won't name them, but they were very concerned about what's going to happen now. The superintendent just resigned.
Yeah.
Very similar to what's happening in New York.
Yeah. Yeah. So the places that stayed with the program did it, but we, rather than kind of working with that coalition of the willing, which really existed at that point, there were some really great leaders, including in Louisiana. We sort of tried to use government carrots to bring everyone in and get everyone on board. And when people are doing things just for the money, they're not going to do it like they should. And I just think we were like an army that got overextended. And I think at this moment, we need to restart this conversation about effectiveness in the public sector. But we do need to be sensitive that education has a lot of purposes, not just test scores. And we need to work in the places where there are leaders who want to get this done.
Yeah, let me add a couple of things that we've done that I think can layer onto this. I generally agree with everything you're saying. I think I have lately come back around. I used to be more pessimistic about the legacy of that period of time, and then lately, we did a 5-part series about the 20 years in New Orleans. We'll link to that in the show notes. Called "Where the Schools Went." Talk to all these people that you probably talked to, John White, all the people in New Orleans, and the combination of that plus the Southern Surge, Mississippi Miracle stuff, plus DC kind of has made me reevaluate the legacy and saying, oh, actually, like hiding in plain sight are a lot of these levers working quietly. We weren't quiet back then. That was part of our problem. There was the Michelle Rhee with the broom. There was, I forget her name, in Newark. There were these people who were kind of busting heads, we're going to come in and Arnie, who I think is one of my favorite people in education, he got himself in trouble for telling some truth on the Common Core to suburban moms in Long Island, to basically saying your kids aren't as smart as you think they are, which I think the sentiment is true, but politically was a time bomb that detonated, I think, in some ways, that took the accountability driven stuff around testing and all that, which in some cases went too far, as you described, Robert. And then combined it with the Common Core, where we had these revisions to all these tests. It was all scary. So we're not only going to be holding teachers accountable, but we're changing the test at the same time. We're throwing around a lot of money, race to the top. So all of that created a perfect marriage between the progressive left and the Tea Party that did some serious damage. But then what emerges from it are remnants of those programs in Tennessee, in Louisiana, in Mississippi, in DC, that to me is like, oh, wow, the stitching here still works. Like, yes, like we don't need to test the hell out of kids, but we should use that data point effectively, right? And actually say, we're not going to, like, your ability to perform on a math and reading test doesn't tell us everything about you, but like a blood pressure test, if it's bad, it tells us something's wrong, right? Like, and then one other piece here, because I'm talking too long, is I talked to I forget his name, the head of the schools in the United Kingdom came on the pod a couple months ago, and they do something interesting that I want to learn more about, which is they not only have their like data driven stuff around tests, but they have a very high quality inspection system where they, instead of being like TPS reports and compliance driven inspections, which is how we do stuff now, which is box checking, they have a really high quality group. I forget what it's called, who know what great instruction looks like and go into schools and rate the schools. So I think if you took that qualitative, like here's what great instruction looks like and did that well, which I don't trust us to do, but in theory would be great. Plus the data driven stuff, that would be awesome. And that's what a lot of high performing networks do. That was a long rant. So I'll allow one of you to jump in there and either add or subtract from that.
Yeah, I'll endorse everything you said there. I think my big question for the next 5 to 10 years is whether Democrats put real political muscle behind all this. I don't think it's exotic what we have to do to improve schools. And I think Robert's point about, going overboard on test scores may be right. But so too is your point about how they tell you something important and that managing an effective school system, like we see it, we know how to do it. Now with the Mississippi Miracle, we've got a template that we can draw on in lots of different places. So, the question I think is whether Democrats are willing to pick some fights with some of their friends that will make it very difficult for this reform to get done. The unions are often they don't always get what they want, but what they are very effective at is saying no to things, and especially saying no to change, which they find threatening, that they don't want to kind of rock the boat. I don't think you need to necessarily be, taking out a broom and picking a fight in kind of an aggressive or harassing kind of way. But I do think a willingness to push back, even quietly. I haven't seen that in recent years, and I don't know if Democrats have the political spine to do it. I hope so. I hope that enough of the public is distressed enough about the flatlining of test scores, and in fact the degradation of test performance over the past 10 or 15 years. I hope that parents are starting to get hopping mad. I see some green shoots, but I'm not sure yet.
One thing is, if you believe in public education, something does have to change. And there's all this new pressure on public schools. And this is an argument to make to labor. Like, what is happening now? We have declining enrollments, partly this, god awful immigration stuff we're getting from Trump, but partly just the trends in this country. If you look 2 years ago, we were expecting declining enrollments, and now we have them. Schools are closing. And then on top of that, we have the Trump tax bill, which going to make a lot of people be able to go to private school. And, I wouldn't have supported that. I don't think it's a good thing, but it's happening, and it's going to happen in blue states too. And so I do think there is a moment here to decide, are we going to have successful and unionized public schools that actually deliver for people? Or are we going to stick to what we've been doing and see more people go to private schools and just manage decline?
Yeah, I think on the private school choice stuff is I used to be completely against it. And the longer I wait and see people in my party like completely ignoring the most vulnerable who are trapped in these systems that we're protecting for political reasons, the more I become open to private school choice. And I think that's the pressure, right? Is like if I were sitting across from my fellow Democrats, I'd be like, if you don't want it, then do what New Orleans did, do what DC is doing right
Do
now.
something.
Yeah, in those cities, I feel differently about it. If you were to ask me, should we have a private school voucher system in New Orleans or in DC or probably in Indianapolis, I would say no, because those cities have done the right thing. But should we have it in Chicago? We already have it in New York, by the way. I've talked about it on this podcast at length. There are about 1,000 families, I think it's about 1,000, who just sue the school system saying that their kids can't be served for special needs reasons. And since de Blasio, we've been handing over $100,000 on average per family to do things like go to horseback riding camp. And these are concentrated in the Upper East Side or whatever. So we already have that for families, right? So this is where I think Democrats have a problem. And you guys pointed out that, and I think this is research on message testing, that actually, if Democrats actually want to start to turn public perceptions in their favor, which there's this brand that we're bad at governance, actually teacher accountability polls better than people think.
Yes.
People look. I think people know that they're held accountable in their jobs, and they expect public workers to be held accountable in theirs. Like there's just a wild unfairness in Democrats currying favor with special interest groups that don't adequately serve or represent the public interest. I mean, you can think that too and care a lot about teachers and cops and firefighters, but think that the institutions that represent them aren't necessarily good for the public.
And they said that it polls better than some other sort of hot button issues that people
Yeah.
blamed the last election. I can't forget what they are. Trans issues, I think, is one of them, like moderating.
Immigration,
Immigration,
both
yeah.
of those issues.
And
Yeah.
this is what's particularly striking in that research is like, that is about what does it take to move the people in the middle? What is it about the people who can turn an election in a close state or nationally? And it turns out that like these issues really matter. And this gets to this point that Nick has made about that's not about what those voters are not going to turn a New York City primary, but they are going to turn a swing state election or a swing district election.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we're over-indexing for what happens in a primary nowadays, and the primaries are increasingly becoming the game for our bench within the party, whether it's members of Congress or state legislators, et cetera. So, by the time we trickle up to senators, governors, presidents, the sort of farm team has developed a record of completely selling out on these issues.
Yeah, I mean,
and so
it's a
very
real
hard to
problem.
turn
Like
back.
if you want to live in New York City and you want to like we've all seen it, right? You go to New York City in your 20s. That's where I went. You live there when you're single. You pair up and you decide, you look around, you have a kid and you think to yourself, I can't afford to live here.
Yes.
And send my kid either to private school at a price that I can't afford or send into a public school that's not going to educate them effectively. Now, there are some good schools in New York City. You can sometimes manage to work the system, but the vast majority of schools are just not going to do the kind of job that lots of upwardly mobile people want them to do. And so they leave. They go to New Jersey. They go to Hoboken. They go to Long Island. They pick up roots. So if you want to actually make New York City a thriving place going forward, you got to make it attractive for young families to stay. And right now, our big cities are failing miserably at that.
Well, let's end on a positive note, guys. So you mentioned two shining is probably an overstatement, but positive trends amongst two different leaders, Mike Johnson in Denver and then former Governor Gina Raimondo in Rhode Island. What is Mike Johnson doing and what did Raimondo do?
Yeah, so we haven't talked about this, but when you have to make layoffs in the public sector, typically the rule is just seniority, last in, first out. And that has the consequence that you got someone who's, fabulous at their job, but been there for 5 years. And you got someone who has just passed the time when they are engaged in their work and doing it well. And it's the second one who keeps their job when you have to do layoffs. And Mayor Johnston, facing a budget deficit, he and his team proactively went and said, we need to change this. And we got to be able to take performance into account. And they did some compromise. They were able to have a back and forth where they said, sure, seniority should matter. It should be a factor, but so should performance. And he got that done, which was a difficult and important thing. And, with state and city budgets where they are, really important. I think if you look at Denver, actually, Colorado, why they did layoffs, which I talked about earlier, it's because they have flexibility. If they were in a world where they had to lay off the 173 most senior people, they never would have done it. They would, or at least senior people, they never would have done it. They would have lost people they wanted to keep and kept people they wanted to lose. It was because they had this flexibility that they could reorganize. So that's incredibly important.
Yeah, and Robert, just to pause there, there's a dance that happens in a lot of places that don't have flexibility, which is if you want to bring in hungry young people or just any new people, you have to bribe the older people to let you do it. It's just incredibly costly and stupid.
Yeah. Yeah. And then Governor Raimondo, Rhode Island had this pension problem that we've all been talking about earlier, and where they weren't able to invest in education at the levels they wanted because of the pension overhang and because of unfunded requirements that were going to build up and cause them huge problems. And she restructured things, and she restructured pensions for workers going forward. And she was able to invest more in education. And by the way, to the political point, like she was the state auditor at the time. She had a bunch of fights about it. Like she then got elected governor, popular, effective governor. Now everyone's heard of her. So I think this can be done both substantively and politically.
Well, good to end on that note. Robert and Nick, thank you so much. We'll link in the show notes to this wonderful article. We really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having us on.
Thanks for having us.
Well, thank you everybody for listening. Remember to rate, review, subscribe to a 5-star rating. Say what you love about the pod wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening to the pod, you could watch all of these on YouTube now. You could subscribe to Lost Debate on YouTube generally. And for those of you on YouTube, if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe. And you could also subscribe to our podcasts on Spotify, Apple, etc. Have a great weekend, everybody.